So we have two presentations in our second panel, and just gonna introduce them, our two speakers, very briefly. Moira Vespina, who is actually a long-term collaborator, was in this project, Lanzunge, since 1.5 years. Actually, we co-organized our workshop in Manila together with Murph. And he conspires and collaborates to prompt parties, platforms, performances, kitchens, festivals, and soundscapes. So we know that one of his recent curatorial project is the Taichung Biennial this year. And he's also very much involved, performed or curated a series of events, including a very recent one in Germany. I think this is Stuttgart, right? At the IFA Gallery. Also a community kitchen and upcoming cookbook of migratory storage and recipes, and also media encounters 2022 ongoing. And also, I think he's also very much involved in experimental film and documentary in the ones called Third World. Yeah, he was also, as I mentioned, one of the co-curators of the 9th Asian Art Biennial. And Arletta Tran, our second speaker. Arletta is actually one of the precious, artistic position we have in this symposium. She is an art laborer based in Saigon, in Ho Chi Minh City, and also recognized for her individual and collective artistic practices with art labor. So I think he's got an upcoming project in Berlin, right, at the Neue Gesellschaft für Bildende Kunst, which is gonna open in 2 weeks. And she presents, a nonlinear and absurd interpretation of modern histories that critically interrogates dominant post-Cold War narratives, concerning the Third World. So her individual and collective works have been exhibited, in many venues, including the National Gallery Singapore, Parasite Hong Kong, Albertinum's Staatliche Kunstmuseum in Dresden, Asia Culture Center in Guangzhou, Jakarta Arts Summit, and the Centre Pompidou in Paris. Without further ado, Merv.
The title will make sense once I go on with the presentation. You can ask me questions later. The first part is a prelude. Decolonial but imperial, Ichiko Kawasai, the creation and construction of Asian cinema. Sound, please. A little bit more. A little bit more. Maybe. Can I do the sound here? Didn't emerge in a vacuum. Built on historic by earlier. One of those visionaries was a Japanese film critic and theorist and cultural activist who in the 1930s and 40s sought to articulate Pan-Asian visions for cinema. Influenced by Japan's imperial ideology, which was both Japanese imperial and Pan-Asian simultaneously. While not as well known, his writings, particularly the creation and construction of Asian cinema in 1941, offer insight into Japan's wartime cultural propaganda and its post-war Cold War intervention. Ichikawa Sai worked with Japan Film Corporation, Nihon Aigasha, producing documentaries and newsreels glorifying the war effort, and advised the Greater East Asia Ministry, shaping cultural policy for occupied regions. Going back to his 1941 text, The Creation and Construction of Asian Cinema, he argued for three main things. The first, anti-Western cultural resistance. How do we position Asian cinema against Hollywood or European dominance? Two, technological collaboration. How can we share film production and distribution networks across Japan's occupied territories, particularly Manchuria, Korea, and Southeast Asia? And three, lastly, was masking colonial domination or an imperial framing. How can we frame Japan as the liberator of Asian cinema? Like many wartime intellectuals, Ichikawa Sai was briefly blacklisted but avoided prosecution during American occupation of Japan after 1945. And like many other Japanese pre war ideas, his thoughts went through Cold War repurposing. His Pan Asian rhetoric resurfaced in sanitized form through Japan's post war cultural diplomacy, such as in Japan Foundation's future programs. Japan Foundation, of course, Goethe Institute's Japanese counterpart. But this time framed as mutual exchange rather than imperialism. While dying in relative obscurity in 1963, Ichikawa Sai's ideas prefigured Japan's soft power strategies in Asia, albeit stripped of overt militarism. His ideas on film as geopolitics demonstrated how cinema was weaponized for empire, a practice mirrored by Cold War superpowers on both sides. One can think that his ideas laid an early blueprint for Asian cinema as a decolonial project, albeit imperialist. The creator of Gamera and the inception of the Asian Film Festival. Another notable person that was also on a list of Japanese war criminals was later discharged from the industry for rehabilitation. Masaichi Nagata was the head of Daei Film Studios. Besides being the creator of Gamera, the giant turtle monster in the clip you just saw, a lesser known pioneer of the kaiju genre besides Gojira, which debuted in 1954 with rival studio Toho Films, Masaichi Nagata came into critical attention in the West for producing Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon in 1950, which won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival in 1951 and was cited as the most outstanding foreign language film released in the US in 1951 and subsequently won a special Oscar in 52. This was, of course, the film that introduced Akira Kurosawa to a global audience. Leveraging the industry clout and geopolitical connections, in 1953, Nagata partnered with his counterpart, Run Run Shaw of the Shaw Brothers and Hollywood's Motion Picture Association, MPA, to create the FPA, Federation of Motion Picture Producers in Southeast Asia, later renamed to the Federation of Motion Picture Producers in Asia. Besides becoming a logistical co-production and distribution network, the banner project of the FPA was its annual film festival. This was supported by the Asia Foundation in an effort to reverse rapidly increasing anti-American sentiments and the growing number of communist sympathizers in the Asian region. The Asia Foundation, of course, was a CIA front, funded by which funded the FPA to counter communist cultural expansion. Asia Foundation's aspirations was to demonstrate that non-communist producers and distributors and exhibitors in Asia would be able to generate substantial profits for churning out non-communist films. Nagata, as you can see here, was unanimously elected as the first president of the FPA. Run Shah, president of the Malay film production in Malaya, became the vice president. The headquarters will be located in Tokyo. Nagata appointed 6 members of the board of directors other than himself, Sen Shah, which included Malik from Indonesia, Ho Alok from Malaya, Prince Yugala of Thailand, Manuel de Leon from the Philippines, Run De Shaw from Hong Kong, and Yamazaki Shuichi from Japan. The first festival was held in Tokyo. It was known as the Southeast Asian Film Festival in 1954. It was later renamed to the Asian Film Festival in 1957, before it became the Asia Pacific Film Festival in 1983. The changes in name best reflecting the changing definitions, economic and geopolitical dreams and realities of those times. The configuration of Southeast Asia, represented in the first Southeast Asian Film Festival in 1954, was led by Japan and included Malaya, Philippines, Indonesia, Hong Kong, and Thailand. South Korea was not yet included because this was just a year after the end of the Korean War. Early on, Malik, the Indonesian delegate and president of Perseroan Film Indonesia, Persari, expressed opposition to the FPA's drafted constitution, particularly its geographical scope that excluded People's Republic of China, PRC, North Korea, Burma, Vietnam, India, and Pakistan. Nagata responded that while Southeast Asian countries are indeed those alongside Pacific Ocean, namely Burma, Malaysia, Malaya, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Japan, and Taiwan, to quote, we have excluded China occupied by the communists. Malik then suggested excluding 2 Chinas altogether, without discrimination, whether it is free or communist China. Rafael Anton, delegate of the Philippines, interceded in the heated debate and proposed a vote among the board members upon receiving a membership application from an organization of motion picture producers in the above-mentioned countries, including those of the communist territories. Anton's proposition was hard to repudiate for Nagata and was taken unanimously. The FPA was no longer able to preclude PRC and North Korean from the organizations as long as the voting members advocated their applications, which meant that this was case to case, according per year, according per location. The aspirations of the FPA and their festival can be seen as an update of an Asian film industry that appeared in Japan in the 1930s, deeply tied to Japan's imperial ambitions across the region. The Greater East Asian Cinema operated under the Japanese Empire's new filmic system, further elaborated by what I just mentioned, Ichikawa Sai's creation and the construction of Asian cinema in 1941, which of course was released just and published just before the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. But by the 1970s, a new imagination of region came into play, fostered by growing economic ties, which expanded from the general consensus of what was known as Asia. In 1978, Australia hosted the 24th Asian Film Festival in Sydney. In the words of the Australian diplomat Frederick Eggleston, Australia had seen itself as an outpost of the British race in an alien sea. But by 1967, Japan had already displaced Britain as Australia's major trading partner. In 1969, 25% of Australian exports went to Japan. Both Australia and New Zealand joined the FPA in 1976. By 1983, the festival was renamed to the Asia Pacific Film Festival, which continues until today. APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, was established only in 1989. Cinematic actions preceded economic ones. Asia Foundation actively funded what they deemed as pro-government films and suppressed dissenting leftist voices. While the Asian Film Festival and other US-backed cultural projects sometimes chose to exclude certain nations. The USSR positioned itself as an alternative to Western cultural hegemony by fostering solidarity with the Third World through institutions like film festivals, literary exchanges, and educational programs without active discrimination. In 1958, 4 years after the first Southeast Asian Film Festival in 1954 in Tokyo, and just the year after the festival was renamed as the Asian Film Festival in 1957, the Solidarity Council of the Afro-Asian countries held the first of three Afro-Asian film festivals. First proposed at the Solidarity Council of the Afro-Asian countries at a conference held in Cairo in December 1957, the Afro-Asian Film Festivals were held in Tashkent in 58, Cairo in 1960, and Jakarta in 64. And they were pivotal in cultural battlegrounds of the Cold War, offering a decolonized alternative to Western-dominated cinema. Their significance lies in their political symbolism, aesthetic radicalism, and enduring influence on global film culture. The first edition in Tashkent in 58 in what is now Uzbekistan was dubbed as the birth of socialist world cinema. Organized by the USSR in what can be seen as a showcase of Soviet soft power, it was the first major non-aligned film festival showcasing films from Africa and Asia promoting Marxist-Leninist solidarity against Hollywood Eurocentric narratives. The festival actively rejected Hollywood tropes, celebrating films like Cairo Station from Egypt and in the last edition of the festival, Sukarno declared, "To hell with Hollywood." Just a year later was the bloody aftermath, the 1965 military coup, which massacred Lekra filmmakers. Lekra was among the hosts of the last edition in 1964 in Jakarta. And many Lekra films were banned, if not destroyed, after the 1965 anti-communist purge. Only in the 2000s were surviving films rediscovered. Many films screened were destroyed or suppressed. Indonesian lacquer works, making their recovery urgent for film historians now. The three festivals provided an essential decolonial blueprint. They proved cinema could be a tool of South-South solidarity, inspiring modern events like the Pan-African Film and Television Festival in Burkina Faso and the Yamagata International Documentary Film Festival. Soviet cultural diplomacy created lasting connections, transnational networks between the Second World Socialist Bloc and the Third World, influencing anti-colonial movements both above and overground. While many talk about the first three festivals, it's also significant to mention what happened in Tashkent 10 years later in 1968. The Tashkent Afro-Asia Film Festival in 1968 was not a direct reboot of the 1958 event, but rather a revival and reimagining of its ideals under a more formalized Soviet-backed framework. The 58 festival was held during the Khrushchev era and could be seen as a diplomatic experiment to showcase Soviet Third World solidarity. It proved the potential of cinema as a tool for anti-colonial solidarity, but faded due to Cold War tensions. Most significantly, the Sino-Soviet split since 1961. The 68 festival revived the 58 spirit, but with more resources and a sharper ideological edge. The 68 festival also mythologized 1958 as a founding moment to legitimize Soviet cultural diplomacy. Lasting from 68 to 1988, it can be seen as strategic escalation of the Cold War's cultural front, not limiting itself to just Afro-Asian films. By 76, it also expanded to include works from Latin America, renaming itself as the Tashkent International Film Festival, becoming an important venue for the nascent third cinema movement. Film festivals are not the only cultural battlegrounds, but so are the actual films. Usmar Ismail's Lewat Jam Malam, After the Curfew, produced in 1954, was funded by the CIA-backed Asia Foundation in their efforts to counter communist influence. And it was of Indonesia's first submissions to the Southeast Asian Film Festival in 1954, the inaugural edition. But by 1968, the Tashkent Afro-Asian Film Festival screened it as an example of anti-colonial cinema, despite its initial US backing. After the Curfew can be seen as an example of one of several works with a unique role as cultural battleground film during the Cold War. Its journey reflects the ideological tensions of the era and Indonesia's shifting political alliances. The film critiques Dutch colonial legacies and post-war societal decay, aligning with the festival's superficial anti-imperialist branding despite US backing. The film's implicit critique of Western-aligned elites clashed with the festival's supposed anti-communist agenda, but its selection showed the festival's tactical flexibility. The CIA-backed Asia Foundation likely tolerated its leftist undertones to co-opt Indonesian cinema. But after 1965's anti-communist coup, Sukarno's leftist cultural policies were erased. By 68, Osmar Ismail, the film's director, and cast were blacklisted in Indonesia for alleged communist ties, yet their work was celebrated in Tashkent in 68. After the Curfew was rediscovered in 68 by Soviet programmers as a relic of Indonesia's radical past. After the Curfew's dual screenings in both the Southeast Asian Film Festival and Tashkent's Afro-Asia Film Festival in 68 exemplify how Cold War festivals repurposed films for competing ideologies. In 1954, it was a universal humanist work. In 1968, it was reclaimed as anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist. The film's shifting legacy mirrors Indonesia's Cold War turmoil, from Sukarno's leftist era to Suharto's US-aligned dictatorship. The film's journey juxtaposed how geopolitics dictated cinematic memory, celebrated or suppressed based on the era's demands. Its recovery challenges Western-centric narratives of global cinema. But Lewat Jam Malam, After the Curfew, was not the only film that traversed both US-backed Asian film festivals and Afro-Asian Soviet-aligned festivals, revealing the ideological tensions and transnational networks of Cold War cinema, a kind of Cold War hedging. This overlap matters to countries like India and Indonesia during the Sukarno years, which used festivals to secure funding from both blocs while maintaining autonomy. Kon Ichikawa's The Burmese Harp from 1956 won Best Director at the 4th Southeast Asian Film Festival in 1957 and was celebrated as a pacifist film aligning with US post-war narratives. But this film was also screened in the Cairo edition of the Afro-Asian Film Festival in 1960, where Egyptian and Soviet critics read it as an anti-militarist critique of Japanese imperialism. Japan's post-war cinema was simultaneously claimed by both Cold War camps, reflecting its unique position as a US ally with anti-war leftist filmmakers. Another film, Satyajit Ray's Pater Panchali, Song of the Little Road from 1955, won prizes at the 3rd Southeast Asian Film Festival in Singapore, promoted by the Asia Foundation as humanist alternative to socialist realism. This film was also shown in the Asian Film Festival in Tashkent in 1968, where Soviet critics praised its anti-poverty themes as universal socialist realism. The film's dual presence again shows how India's non-aligned movement leveraged both blocs for prestige while avoiding overt political alignment. Hainin's The Little Girl of Hanoi from Vietnam in 1974 was funded by East German and Soviet studios. This anti-war film was a centerpiece at Tashkent, symbolizing socialist solidarity. It was, of course, banned by Asian Film Festival in 1975, but pirated copies circulated among leftist filmmakers in the Philippines and Indonesia, demonstrating the Iron Curtain in film distribution, where Soviet-aligned films were excluded from US-backed festivals but still influenced Asian cinema underground. While winning local awards in martial law era Philippines under Marcos dictatorship, Maynila sa Kuko ng Liwanag, Manila in the Claws of Night from 1975 by the much lauded Filipino tour Lino Broca was rejected by the Asian Film Festival because it was too left for comfort. Eventually screened at the Fifth Tashkent Festival in 1976, where it won acclaim as the third cinema masterpiece and was heavily circulating ever since. Braca was heavily influenced by Latin American third world cinema and actively critiqued US imperialism in the 1970s and 80s. In both his films and social activism, Braca became a bridge between Soviet and Global South filmmakers. What can be seen particularly in the case of Braca is that censorship in US aligned festivals actually pushed radical filmmakers towards Soviet, Afro-Asian, or third cinema networks. While Suharto or Marcos, along with other US-backed totalitarian regimes, can try to actively obscure the transnational impact of critical artists and their works, uh, exposing the USSR's counter networks, echoing anti-Western solidarity, but with socialist aims. Far from an easy binary of US-Soviet divide, it's also important to highlight the agency of post-colonial intellectuals and artists in shaping socialist world culture, sometimes as themselves or as representatives of their nation states. Filmmakers from Japan, India, and Indonesia before the Philippines later, and consistently participated in both platforms. Circling back to Ichikawa Sai, the Afro-Asia Film Festivals revived anti-Western solidarity akin to Ichikawa Sai's rhetoric, but framed through class struggle. The Asia Foundation film programs in the 50s, 60s, and the Asian film festivals echoed Ichikawa Sai's call for intra-Asian collaboration, but rebranded to counter communism, not Western colonialism alone. Asia Foundation and the Asia Film Festival series can be seen as a way for the U.S. co-opted regionalism to serve its Cold War aims. Ichikawa Sai's top-down pan-Asianist imperial project contrasts with both Soviet anti-colonial leftist networks and US soft power. Yet all three reveal how Asian cinema was constructed through geopolitical agendas and the efforts of individual artists and cultural actors. Film, cinema, moving image, these are easily populist mediums, more accessible than theater, visual arts, and literature. It's not an accident that films, and not just film festivals, became important ideological battlegrounds in the cultural Cold War. But Broca and many others also identified the limitations and issues with the medium itself and how it could distort how we conduct ourselves in reality, regardless of ideology, and perhaps opening the door to other monsters. Eh? Nande? Thank you. That was the last slide. Thank you. Thanks, slide.
So my talk will not necessarily follow historical research, chronological, or inductive logic. It will be a collage of thoughts gathered with inspiration and a lot of intuition from interpreting and appropriating images, archives, and my own artworks. So instead of selecting a picture of an auditorium with classic 19th century assembly architectural design, this photo shows the plenary meeting during the Bandung Conference in 1955 on much smaller and intimate scale. Imagine that the seating arrangement in the main conference venue were in a large auditorium, despite the attempts of equality in alphabetical order. The seats were in enlarging circular rows, with a podium stage like one in the lecture hall. There's a center of gravity in the audience. The auditorium highlights the speaker's platform area, thus emphasizing the speaker's representative and performative act. In contrast to that seating, I am more interested in the negotiating and generative gestures in smaller scale dialogues. The seating arrangement around the oval table, like in the pictures, created the cabinet feel, where face-to-face talks occurred. The structure of the oval room suggests a more local, inward, and bodily feel. The distance between the seating positions is the same for everyone around the table. Speech can come from any side. This meeting room typography is often the place to solve problems and allow straightforward, direct encounters. And this small-scale, non-angled table is reminiscent of the dinh, the communal village house in a Vietnamese political system. My association with this trait does not intend to criticize their backwardness. On the contrary, it acknowledges the autonomy and solidarity of small group of independent actors with similar backgrounds to solve their problems together, rather than waiting for the services from high authority. In the book Parcours d'une Nation, modern historian Philippe Papin commented that the feudal political system in Vietnam allowed people from the countryside to self-nominate, compete and participate in the mandarinate. Although Papin argued that village autonomy was not absolute, he acknowledged that the political situation in pre-colonial Vietnam was very different from China, where the origins of Confucianism and the Mandarin system spread to neighboring countries. If the Chinese political elites from the regime were primarily concentrated in the urban areas, the stratification of political autonomy in Vietnam was located mostly in small social units such as villages. Most Mandarins came from the countryside, having passed through years of honing their literary and historical knowledge, and then returned to the countryside to work. At the dinh, the precinct at the scale of small and medium-sized temple, where political and cultural events of the village were practiced, formed the core of national polity. All started in a village. Very often, it all ended in a village. The main power was obtained from the countryside, and standing firm was also thanks to the countryside. At the Bandung Conference event, the 29 Asian and African nations shared the desire to be the core of the polity in their den of alliances. No matter how politically immature or economically underdeveloped, like the peripheral areas compared to the centralized capital, they sought standing firm status. In such a crucial process, building their own den needed them to dig up the national thoughts to fortify the structural foundation, and at the same time create lanes connecting neighbors to gather internationality. In this photograph, Technochrome Diplomatic Gifts of my photography series Technochrome Orchid Dream, which simulates the time-traveling expedition of peripheral modernization, mimics the gifting gestures with a political metaphor at diplomatic events in Southeast Asia during the Cold War that often used orchids as the national symbols of grace and wisdom. One can recall the orchid gift at the beginning scenes in the infamous Cold War movie, The Ugly American. The indecisiveness of the orchid color selection as a diplomatic gift in the photo, the red of the communism, the yellow of the feudal monarchy, or of American liberalism. The invisible character seems to choose the chrome orchid branch on the right, attempting to demonstrate their remixed style of strategies. It weaves in the liberally imaginative and non-conforming, refuses to choose solid colors, and prefers highly reflective, neutral, futuristic chrome medium to hint at reflection from the past, present, and the future. In the context of the Republic of Vietnam in the 50s, choosing diplomatic relations in the newly established years was not as simple as selecting the diplomatic bouquet in the photos. just as the possibility of successfully cultivating and nurturing a modern ideologies like the beautiful Rome orchid would be unlikely to take place in the threat of the empires that spread political ideas like imperialist plantations worldwide. In addition, even if the third world countries were carrying such a non-aligned futuristic Rome ambition, these alliances members would constantly look at and question at each other. In Bandung, the international leaders gave opinions that conflicted with each other. Sukarno opened the conference by citing the American Revolution. John Korilawala, Ceylon's prime minister, asserted that countries in Central and Eastern Europe were also subject to colonial rules by the Soviets. The pro-Western head of the Philippines delegations, Carlos Rumolo, paraded his blatantly antipathy for hardcore neutrals, especially Nero, Gaman, Aben Nasser, and UNO. Chinese Politburo member Deng Xiaoping confessed to Soviet ambassador Shevchenko that the struggle with bourgeoisie figures like Nehru, Sukarno, and Nasser was one of the most important problems facing for the international communist movement. In a memo of Nguyễn Thái, Director General of Vietnam Press, one of the delegates of the Republic of Vietnam, Southern Vietnam at Bandung, he recalled a meeting with Nehru right before the conference officially opened. The private meeting became immediately as Nehru's lecture about the position of India towards Asia, including southern Vietnam. And the meeting ended with the tension between Vietnamese delegates demonstrated their similarity with India and Vietnam, but at the same time, they want to remain their self-determination rather than, again, under the other foreign imposition. Let us now follow Nguyễn Đăng Thục, one of the most influential intellectuals in the construction of Southern Vietnam ideological system, to reveal the connection with this image. So in December 1956, Nguyễn Đăng Thục, the northern Vietnamese immigrant to the south, a professor of Eastern philosophy and Vietnamese literature in the Faculty of Letters in Saigon, left for Delhi to attend the Asian Writers' Conference as a representative of the Republic of Vietnam. He certainly knew about the Bandung Conference that had taken place a year earlier. In India, he learned about that before the Bandung event was born. A precursor to the Continental Union was the Asian Relations Conference in 1947. Then he also learned that it was the very first international event organized by an Asian country, including 193 delegates and 39 government observers from 28 countries in Asia and 8 international organizations as observers. Of course, in addition to the representative from Malaya, greeted by Nehru in these photos, perhaps the most notable for Nguyễn Đăng Thục was the presence of Democratic Republic of Vietnam, aka Northern Vietnamese delegation, that arrived to India with the hope of securing support against the French. And their rivals in Indochina, the French who controlled Cambodia, Cochinchina, Southern Vietnam, and Laos, has also been able to secure the invitation to this conference. After that, the French complained to the Indian representative in Saigon that it was being left out. Impressed by this historical event, a year later, in 1957, Nguyễn Đăng Thục went to Paris and then returned to New Delhi to study about this. If the Bandung Conference in 1955 was organized by governments of different countries, bring with it the fiery mood of political struggles and proposing specific moves in foreign and domestic strategies. The Asian Relations Conference in 1947 was organized by Indian Council of World Affairs, an independent agency specializing in international relations research. So it took an academic research and exchange of ideas and cultures as the premise for the Continental Alliance. At the conference, aims to provide a cultural and intellectual revival and the social progress in Asia, independent of all questions of internal as well as international politics. Notably, in this opening speech, Nehru, still vice president of the Executive Council of India at the time of the conference, emphasized this continent's intellectual alliance. I hope that out of this conference, some permanent Asian institute for the study of common problems to bring out the closer relations will emerge. Also, perhaps the School of Asian Studies. Further, I might be able to organize inter-exchange of visits and exchanges of students and professors so that we might know each other better, as well as the value of cultural heritage of the community and nations. So inspired from this conference, Professor Nguyễn Đăng Thục founded Hội Việt Nam Nghiên cứu Liên lạc Văn hóa Á Châu, the Vietnamese Association for Asian Cultural Relations. A year after that, in 1958, with the organization, he consolidated into the monthly academic journal entitled Văn hóa Á Châu, as you see in the slide, Asian Culture Monthly, using cultural alliances here as the intercontinental territorial defense program instead of political ideals. In the first issue, his opening article emphasized the importance of Vietnamese cultural awareness that is exchanged and influenced by two streams of cultures from South Asia and China. In it, he quoted from parallel authors of these two cultural streams. With the South Asian stream, the article cited Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, and René Guénon, the French philosopher who devoted himself to Sufi Islamic philosophy. And it is remarkable that in the citation presenting Chinese influence, intentionally, Nguyễn Đăng Thục did not directly quote Confucius or Lao Tzu. Instead, he quoted Vietnamese Confucian scholars from different historical periods, such as Lý Thường Kiệt, the general and admirer of Lý dynasty, the leader who defeated the Song army. Emperor Trần Thái Tông, the first king of Trần dynasty who set the first foundation of Buddhism as the national religion parallel to the orthodox Confucian thought. The Nguyễn Đình Chiểu, the anti-colonial poet. Phan Chu Trinh and Phan Bội Châu, the leaders of reformist movement in the early 20th century. It is essential also to note here that the Confucian research direction of the scholars in southern Vietnam was closely related to the new Confucianism school of thoughts, which is initiated by generations such as Lý Shòng Minh, Xiao Shili, Feng Yulam, and He Ling, rising to prominence in the 20s and 40s, when the Chinese intellectuals struggled to make sense of the changing world. And then with the successive generations of these intellectuals who immigrated to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the American. Nguyễn Đăng Thục published various works on Eastern philosophy, on Southeast Asian studies literature. On the second issue of Văn hóa Á Châu, he wrote this article, Asian Heritage and Marxism, to advocate for the recitation of spiritual heritage to create the new modern Asianness. In it, he analyzed UNO's strategy for Burma to prove the similarity with the circumstances of Vietnam. Quoted, UNO criticized Marx for only focusing on production as the key to all human activity. Production is always the action of the group, and the group is the unit. The individual must completely subordinate to the group, and the nation of the individual having his own separate status in relation to the group is nonsense. It was this point that UNO vehemently opposed the defense of his belief, as well as that the majority of the Burmese people that man is not merely composite of atoms, but a supplied beings of free will that does not perish after death. From UNO Burmese case, Nguyễn Đăng Thục then continued, having liberated from foreign sovereignty, the Asian people must awaken fully to reorganize their individual and collective lives spiritually and materially. Thus, we must have an ideology to guide our actions. Suppose such ideology cannot be borrowed from Marxism and capitalism, both of which are products of geographically and historically context of Western engineering. Can Asia itself create an ideology suitable to its economic and historical circumstances? In this collage, titled The Curator's Nightmare, from the series of Technochrome Orchid Dream, we see fragments of artworks and antiquities damaged during the transit to the United States. These images to me look like the photographs of found objects, of ready-made conceptual artworks, or also can be evidences of stolen and smuggling artifacts from the colonial period. This theme resonates not only to the trauma-induced dreams of the post-colonial community, but also reflects the harsh realities that continue even after the independence from French colonialism. During the preparations for the exhibition Art and Archaeologies of Vietnam, Asian Crossroads of Culture, held in 1960s at the Smithsonian, presenting Vietnamese identity, it facing a lot of challenges. This exhibition was the significant initiative from the government of Republic of Vietnam, making the first time the country's art and culture were presented internationally as the independent sovereign state. It was part of the trend of national exhibitions across various museums and universities in the United States during the late 50s to early 60s, similarly to showcases of Korea and Thailand at the Met in New York, or the establishment of the Japan Society. As indicated in Nguyễn Đăng Thục research journals, art historians and archaeologists of this committee sought to position Vietnam within the civilization that intersected with neighboring cultural influences, fostering alliances. However, unlike the academic writings that connect the Neo-Confucian influence with Taiwan and Hong Kong, some artifacts, particularly those of the imperial or the Buddhist significance, were challenging to disassociate from the influence of mainland China. Many of these artifacts also resided either in the archaeological or the religious sites in northern Vietnam, which they had no access to, or had been looted and sent to France. Conversely, the experts on this research committee aimed to provide a fresh and alternative perspective on Vietnamese culture, one that did not merely follow the north-south axis from China that looked horizontally towards the Southeast Asian, as you see in the map. This vision included Ốc Eo and Champa civilization located in southern Vietnam. Artifacts from Ốc Eo even highlighted the connections between the Mekong River estuary and trade relations, as well as aesthetic exchanges extending to the Greeks and Rome. Thus, from geopolitical standpoint, this exhibition could serve as a meaningful link to regional allies and the roots of Western civilization. Despite this ambition, the curator faced a troubling request from France, their le même patrie, both a former colonial power enemy and also the ally of the republics of Vietnam, current allies, the United States. In the handwritten note here that I found in the archive, the Minister of Education of the Republic of Vietnam addressed to the curator's team, stating, on the occasion of the exhibition in the United States concerning antiquities, Mr. Janser, the advisor of the exhibition, suggested that we lend some Ốc Eo objects. However, since he still advocates that we should return some or mostly of these artifacts to France, the Ministry of Education could not approve that. Let them borrow from other French museums if they want to. Due to this caution, the exhibition featured only a few valuable large-scale antiquities. Yet, this was sufficient to showcase the diverse culture of South Vietnam. However, in my wicked thought, although not explicitly stated, it was evident that the territorial boundaries of the nation-state, called Vietnam, has significantly expanded southward over the centuries through military conquest, trade, colonization, and also marital alliances with the Northern Court. So with this emphasis of the loss or repressed civilization in Southern Vietnam, this exhibition, as the Smithsonian, actually foresee the future of this young and short-lived Republic of Vietnam. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for watching. Actually, yeah, let's improvise. Actually, and these two, you guys know these two. They have been friends actually for many years, right? For like more than 15 years, and you know each other very well. So I gonna start this panel without before we got familiar on many academic issues. Gonna start in a very relaxed way, right? So we can just improvise a little bit because also your presentations are somehow based on this improvisation. I don't know. So the first question actually I have is actually for Aleta. So this video you made last year, right? Just want to know because you already mentioned it in your presentation about this exhibition art and archaeology in the 1960s, and just could you tell us a little bit more about how you get access to the materials to the archive? Yeah, because I think can I say that because before you are also a curator somehow, right? Yeah. So I think there's kind of a research methodology you somehow has been used, yeah, since years, right? So just tell us a little bit more about the research.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I have always been really interested in the intellectual life and how visual and artistic and cultural representation in Southern Vietnam before 1975, because it's basically being forbidden for us as a Vietnamese now to access to the materials. So I went inside. I had to make different ways in order to get access to the National Archive in Vietnam, and also the Hoover Institute at Stanford in America to research about what was going on. And then I found out about this exhibition in 1960. And what was very interesting, I think quite fateful for me. So at first, when I dig up the research, it was just like generally about the exhibition. But then when I found out that the transportation of the artwork at that time was carried on by the USS, which is the Army attack ship, and it docked in Saigon in 1960, which is before the official American Army involvement into Vietnam. So that was like way before the war, the actual fighting. But the attack assault ship landed to Vietnam for art and culture to take the shipping from Saigon, and before that was in Bangkok to America. And I found out that the person who accompanying with the artworks and antiquities was Nghiêm Thầm, the curator, that was in this film. And when I did the research about that, I was in a Hoover, and I was sitting there in a Hoover, digging up the documents of Asia Foundation sponsoring his trip to America on that associate and the many months preparation for this show. I received the invitation from Asia Foundation sponsoring me to come into America. I was already America at that time, but then just for that research.
Yeah.
But when I was in that room at Hoover, I don't know if you have been to Hoover Institute. It is like a bunker, and it's a lot of surveillance. You cannot bring anything inside, and when you got outside, you have to, like show your shirt, open up your computer. So I was sitting there, received that invitation from Asia Foundation. And it was like after Nghiêm Thầm in 1960, 62 years later, they, for the first time, that they re-sponsor the person from control sector to America. Um, and I did a fellowship at Asia Art Museum in San Francisco. And they also asked me to maybe do an exhibition about Vietnam. So I think it's kind of like the repetition of history, from his life to my life. And Nghiêm Thầm was murdered, as you see in the film. Hopefully, I mean, like, I didn't do any exhibition on Vietnam, so maybe I'm still safe. Um, so yeah, it's just a few anecdotes that, of course, it's like, as the curator, like my previous career, my previous life, as digging in the research in archive, but at the same time, it's also very emotional and kind of like a destiny for me to feel with this story and with this history. Yeah.
So it has been shown actually outside of the country, outside Vietnam, right? This work
Yeah, it
Yeah.
has never been shown in Vietnam,
in Vietnam.
actually.
Okay, yeah. So a question to move now. I think because these two film festivals, this FBA Film Festival and the Afro Asian Festival, and somehow you talk about the it's kind of an in and out of confrontational ideologies, and it reminds me of something that I think our documentary colleagues may know very well. I think it's the very first director of Documenta, Werner Haftmann, right? Is his name, an art historian, and he is actually, one of the major figures who promoted abstract art after from the 1950s, after the war, actually. And then I think very recently, people discovered that he used to serve for Nazis, right? This is a Nazi official, and also somehow got involved in a military action against the resistance of the of Italy. And then we all know that abstract art, during the Nazi regime, was seen as degenerate art and anti-art kunst. And then, but after that, after the war, he turned into somebody who promote abstract art. So that's quite interesting because this is kind of a double agent, or this bridge builder you talk about, actually. Something that we cannot be, something about, political stances that we cannot really rely on when accessing or when, evaluating certain art practices, right? So I think, but behind all of this, I mean, what's your, this is the start, I want to start with a very personal question. What's your motivation, actually?
Sounds like in interrogation.
Yeah.
No,
to to conduct this research. No, I know this it has a long history of a curatorial approach methodologies, but still, let's start from a very personal level. What's the motivation of this?
I-
Why is that interesting for you?
I like to know where my
Yeah.
money's coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the interest in this research started um, with um, the actually a project with Grace, which was the Sun Shower, which was a huge Southeast Asian art exhibition.
Mm,
And of course, it was very heavily handed,
mm,
very Japanese. And why this heavy Japanese presence in Southeast Asia? So it was a process of starting to unpack and research that.
mm,
How is and it doesn't really end in just the Cold War. You have to go back into the 1800s, like Meiji Restoration.
mm,
Um, in order to try to understand, like, why this interest in this particular region, why Japanese imperialism is so tied to also this like Pan-Asianism, and then the different imaginations of Japanese Pan-Asianism, and how that also still figured in after the war, and how it was repurposed by the Allies, and how it also contrasted with the other transnational networks during similar time periods, and also how things are can also at the same time be very slippery. I don't think that that's why I ended with giving examples of like after the curfew, which was CIA funded, but also showed in Tashkent in 1968. So over time, like, okay, actually that's subversive. Like, oh wow, even though it was like, oh, Asia Foundation, CIA backed. It was kind of open knowledge that okay, yeah, that CIA funded it, but let's show it in Tashkent in the when they were reimagining this Afro Asia Film Festival again. Um, so mm, so the similar to how the regions are framed, um like it varies over time, and also and the films also changed, the interpretations of the films also change over time. So you can read the same book or you can watch the same like film over and over again, but maybe you can find new meaning as you with repeat watchings, because you're not the same, time is not the same, like the geopolitical moment is not the same. So this is what I was looking into. Mm.
Okay, let's get back to that. Afro-Asian Film Festival in Tashkent. I think this was recent a published book by Rosen Jagalov. I think.
Yes,
Yeah, I think you know that book, From Internationalism to Post-Colonialism, right? That's the title of the book, and he mentioned something about Tashkent as a city because it's, let's say, it's not Moscow, right? When it would have been held in Moscow, this festival, it should be totally different, right? Because Tashkent is more like, as he put it, a kind of more diverse city and non-white society in a way, right? So also I think it's also a city that somehow really could reflect on this, let's say, the great achievements of Soviet Union and with certain historical localities there, right? So in Tashkent. And then he also mentioned that people who first showed up there, invited by the festival and showed up there, and in this gathering were somehow surprised to meet each other because many of them, or most of them, are more familiar with nuances of less Western art, literature, music, theater, and so on, right? But they are not so familiar with the neighbor countries, with their art productions, with their cultural policies, and so on. So this is actually the first time people, let's say from the socialist bloc, brought together to really get to know each other. And one thing very interesting, I think also you discuss it a little bit also. For example, I think in the Soviet Union people, they were so interested in melodramas, actually, something that really lacked in their country at that time. And but people there in the film festival who showed their cultural practice there, somehow didn't really provide that kind of thing, the melodrama of this kind of thing. So this created really a very interesting situation of people, getting together, but somehow really get to know each other's, another side of each other, and then another face of each other. So maybe, I don't know. I mean, this third worldist, solidarity, somehow started, initiated by the Soviet Union in the 1950s, and then it changed somehow in the 1960s, as you put it, right? There's a lot of South-South, solidarity going on than the one that initiated by the Soviet Union. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about um, the Tashkent as a city and some more details and how they discuss there. What kind of dynamics there you expose there, and then
I can only speculate. I think I
yeah.
haven't been to Tashkent.
Yeah.
Me has been to Tashkent.
Oh, okay.
Actually, since you mentioned the book,
Mm,
Rosen Jagalov's book, it actually came out the same year as Lee Sun Jung's book,
mm,
which is so they were this published the same year, released the same year in 2020,
yeah.
which is like wow, really nice companion pieces, which is like Lee's cinema and the cultural Cold War, and
Yeah.
then Rosen Jagalov's from internationalism to like post colonialism,
Uh-huh.
something like that, which looked at second and third, yeah, the Tashkent movement and like second the USSR's angle in that in the cultural Cold War.
Mm,
Um, which was great because then it consolidated some of the resources that were like disparate, and also like really delved into archives that were, you know, some of which were just recently declassified. Um, but I guess like the pick for Tashkent was because you know it was the Silk Road, a
mhm,
Silk Road city.
mm,
Um, I think, and they were trying to build it up, and it was because I think uh, Kazakhstan wasn't gonna fit there because Kazakhstan was they're developing it more as a science base for the space program.
mm,
So like okay, and Tashkent as a city was like you said was very multicultural.
mhm,
Um, but it's interesting that they had to they pick up the slack again because I think the research in the Southeast Asian region really focused a lot on the Jakarta moment, perhaps.
mhm,
So the first three, but not the what do you call this the redux, right?
mm,
The 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 reimagining, which was in 1968.
mm,
Um, but I think it was still it by the time that it restarted, a lot of people started to get more bearings. Like there was more like third world cinema, like as a movement, was also coming up, especially in South America, and then and other filmmakers were also trying to be political and aesthetically minded and trying to create new aesthetics outside of the West. And so festivals like this were important, and
mm,
it's also interesting, like that the films don't change, but also the positions, ideological, cultural positions of the different people watching them, and critics also see the works as very different. And I also wanted to mention, like, um, I don't know if it was that apparent when I presented, but actually, uh, the Western Bloc had more censorship. It actually excluded more artists, countries, works, and which actually helped the Third World Project, the Soviet agenda,
mm,
um, because they were rejected there, so they found venues elsewhere.
mm, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. There's another, actually, in Tashkent, it's also if I get it right, it's the first Asian writer conference, right? It's still also in Tashkent,
The right, the yeah, it's
right?
there.
Right? It's still
Yeah,
also
yeah,
true,
yeah.
right? I mean, right, right? And you also walk us through in your presentation, right, about this continental solidarity of intellectuals at the time, and there was this guy from southern Vietnam, right, writing about writing about Eastern philosophy, things like that, right? So there's also kind of an appeal for Asian autonomy through this reproduction with intellectualities. Can you tell us more about this, and how did you get to that material? How did you encounter this material? Actually, because throughout your presentation, this is very fragmentary presentation, right? There's certain images archive you encounter, and it was like uh, it somehow really speak to you the way you work, right? So tell us more about this Asian Writer Conference and this solidarity of intellectuals. Yeah.
So it's actually um, from the exhibition at the Smithsonian in 1960.
Yeah.
Because in the press release of that exhibition and also during the research, a lot of documents really emphasize that, okay, let's present in this exhibition not focusing on the Chinese influence into Vietnamese culture, but in the Southeast Asian islandic area. But at the same time, when I read the history that the first Republic of Vietnam was really celebrating a lot of the Confucianist heritage. So I was curious that if they talk about Confucianism and also the influence of Buddhism, which the branch of that Buddhism in Vietnam was actually influenced from China. Uh, so how can they, you know, analyze about that? But at the same time, um, having kind of like, because it's the still within the anti-communist discourse. So that's why I came across this journal by Nguyễn Đăng Thục that, as in my presentation, that actually it turned out that a lot of these scholars that research about Confucianism in southern Vietnam, that they aligns with a lot in Taiwan, and also with some conference that took place in Hawaii, that this Hong Kong and Taiwanese and Chinese American scholars came there to talk. So that's why I kind of like came across this journal. But when I read about this journal, it's also that it's not just about the Chinese Confucianism or Buddhism, but Nguyễn Đăng Thục also emphasizes a lot the case studies in Burma, and that the UNO, that he analyzes a lot of strategies of UNOs in Burma that I talked in the presentation, and also that his original ideas of this journal came from what Nehru spoke at the conference in Delhi in 1947. So it's really interesting for me to see like how all of this, how to say, trying to navigate the identity as the new nation, as the Vietnam. What is the position of Vietnam in the history? Like, how do you claim this civilization in a way by, okay, this Ốc Eo and Funan civilization in southern Vietnam claiming as part of the Vietnamese culture in the exhibition. But when you claim that, initially, that is becoming to Vietnam because of the colonization from the Vietnam from the north to the south. So it's a very kind of like, I think, interesting discourse of, but also I think very puzzling for the southern Vietnamese intellectuals who work among all of this discourse within the political agenda of and navigating powers during the Cold War.
Yeah. So let's open to the audience. Yeah, Q&A. We have the mic. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. Also, Ala, the film is really touching. I might return to it tomorrow. I thought of maybe sketching out some ideas that I actually started speaking about earlier, which came again, I think, in the presentation, in Arli's presentation, when you quoted this Asian culture journal, right? When you say, or one of the person, I don't remember the name, unfortunately, said something like, "Can Asia create its own ideology and economy?" Right. So once again, it's that sort of national. Well, it's not. It's regionalism, but it's kind of at a moment when nationalism was probably not yet as fixed and has such a bad press as we understand it today. I was thinking of this also in relation to the broader U.S. kind of Cold War tactics, because up until a point, it was actually quite convenient for the U.S. to work with nativist and nationalist powers in Asia. So there was a thing called the Jakarta ICM. It's not the Jakarta method, but a more earlier moment. And I think the end point was something like 1953, when the Iranian nativist nationalists nationalized their oil field. So there's this whole thing with, how does nationalism figure in the process of modernization, decolonization, in the Cold War contestation of power, which I think remains hovering above many of us and many of our research. So I just wanted to park that there. But I also wanted to thank Merv. You make my job very easy tomorrow, because I actually realized it's so much more difficult to make a case for, the same artwork can work in different contexts, totally without any problem. I think it's much easier in the film. So, to the some comments that were made on Tashkent. We or I actually have a quite interesting, quite long conversation and partial engagement with the current Uzbek National Cultural Foundation, ACDF. So you would think that, as a new foundation headed by the daughter of the president, conveniently, and wanting to big up, the Uzbek, art and culture in contemporary times, it's logical to work with the legacy of Tashkent Film Festival, right? So a friend of mine, Foucault, actually started making a whole journal for the Tashkent International Film Festival, and for the ACDF Foundation. And then last minute they called it off. All of a sudden they cannot deal with it politically. I don't know why exactly, but basically this is the reality of the sort of post-Soviet countries when they are looking at the legacy of a cultural event such as the Tashkent Film Festival. Wow. And with that, I also want to say, Rawson's book is really quite important in highlighting not just what had happened on the ground, but also the afterlives of the Tashkent Film Festival and Afro-Asian Writers Conference, where he basically tracked down the names of the writers who third world, quote unquote, third world country writers who first appeared in Tashkent. Right, representing their country and being part of, in general, a third worldism. How 2 decades later, when the whole project, this whole socialist project basically collapsed, they were assimilated into US university departments. Many of them ended up in comparative lit, post-colonial studies. So basically same people, kind of going through the revolving door to the US side. And that is a very, very I'd say loaded as afterlife of the socialist, the third worldist project in terms of cultural production. There was another point. I know so far there's no question. Another interesting point, I just kind of wanted to park it there again, is the film festival in Tashkent, when they were hosting that, I think the organizers really wanted to also start a film market, right? Because, nowadays you go to Cannes Film Festival and there's not just the film festival, there's also a film market where the distributors meet and, sell licenses. So they wanted to do that actually for Tashkent. And that, in a way, I think connects to the whole question of market that Kat raised earlier, right? Because not only the free world or the capitalist world was interested in the market, the socialist world was also interested in market, or at least saw a problem in the absence of a market, where then you will have much less channels for information exchange. So I just wanted to put it there because I think with this panel, we're slowly moving to, not just looking at the free world, but in approaching a sort of a more comparative way of thinking in between the different blocks. Sorry, that was all a very long comment, I guess.
Yes, taking one of the words you said about the so-called free world on the one hand, whereas Merv said that the most monstrous censorship happened in the so-called free world. I don't know whether that's a contradiction, maybe it is, but considering the way censorship worked in the West, I wonder how you came to that conclusion, since those censorship systems are so different. And I presume that not every country would be so, let's say, obsessive as the United States in the Cold War to suppress certain kinds of films. So how did you come to that conclusion? Maybe you could elaborate on that in 1 or 2 words. Thank you.
Oh, it's hard to elaborate in 1 or 2 words. But no, that I was I said that because in particularly of like a Philippine context. Um and for some of the films that I mentioned, of course, there's censorship in the Soviet bloc and in the Second World, but it's a different kind of censorship. Um, and and it's something that maybe people are more ready to accept, right? Because they're not marketing themselves as a free world. Um, but the U.S. aligned countries are they're saying like we are the free world, but except for communists and communist sympathies and like except this and that, and which is pretty much the direction that the U.S. is now heading, right? Um, so this the exceptions to the rules in supposedly free countries is an interesting dilemma. Um, and in the Philippine case, it actually pushed and like yeah pushed people to look into different networks. Um, I think that it there's more research to be done with the Philippine works that were screened in Soviet affiliated film festivals, because I think that I think the Philippine research has been really aligned towards a more Western model and like region specific model. And what's enriching about these other festivals that are outside of these boring kind of like sorry, Barry, area studies kind of thinking, or area studies kind of like historical framing, is that like I think in this third in the broader second third world like researches, it's not no, it's not just really fixed to particular area studies or regions, but larger. But a larger anti-imperialist struggle. But then again, going back to what you said, like I can't. Of course, there was a lot of censorship also in like Africa, in South America, and even within the Philippines. So like there were different cuts of certain films. Like this is the cut that will show Marcos. So the Manila by Night was also shown in the Philippines. There were the different cuts of the films made its way to different festivals around the world, but there were ways around going them, um, and it's also very exciting as a researcher to look into like which versions made it to where, which was more acceptable to which location, to which venue. And it's surprising that what you thought would be more free would actually not.
Thank you. I have a question for Arletta. I enjoyed your presentation and your film very much. In your presentation, a sort of dominant trope is that of origin cultures, India and China in particular, and Vietnam resisting their, hegemonic propositions, right? Or rather, selectively including and omitting these origin cultures at various points in time. The way in which you juxtapose your film with your lecture, it almost feels like, yes, this tussle for origin cultures and cultural hegemony is ongoing in Asia, but the real enemy lies elsewhere, which you hint at with the arrival of the US warship. Is that how one reads these two projects? Or are you saying that, that burden of origin cultures carries through, where the protagonist, the curator of your film, is also being pressured into manufacturing, almost manufacturing a script that would then position Vietnam as an origin culture? So is that what your protagonist ultimately cannot take?
Um, so these characters, this Nghiêm Thầm, the art historian, and I think he was maybe the first trained curator in Vietnam. I think his whole life dealt with this question of the origin of Vietnam. Um, he was trained at Louvre in France, archaeology and art history. Um, and his dissertation is also about what does it mean to be the heritage of Vietnam. He was actually from Hanoi, um, and he went to France to study in the 50s before the French colonialism collapsed. So when he decided to return in 1955, both the communists and the Southern Vietnam asked him to come. Um, and then he decided to move to the South. And then he made this exhibition um, with Janse, who was actually one of his supervisor during his study time in France. So Janse is the advisor for this exhibition at the Smithsonian. Um, but Janse collaborated with the French in the past during the colonial time, meaning that he helped the French to loot a lot of artifacts from Vietnam to France. So when Nghiêm Thầm was on a mission with this exhibition, he deals with his supervisor, former supervisor, trying to give the voice that the Vietnam committee wanted, but also at the same time how to navigate with the greed from the French museums wanting to loot it more. Um, and at the same time, how to be as the academic making the curation, but with the backing from the political agenda of the government, both from South Vietnam and America. And then he became the director of the History Museum in South Vietnam until 1975, but he decided to stay in Vietnam because he thought that, well, in the past, the communists already liked me, invited me, so he decided to stay until this incident in 1979 that, well, because Vietnam at that time was sided with the Soviet Union, and China was not happy with that, and there was the Sino-Vietnam War, and also with the Cambodian in the south. So that's why this discourse of rewriting the history of the origin of Vietnam came up. So the war was not just at the front, at the border, but it's also trying to take place in the academic world. So that's why he was called up to do this mission. And he refused to do that. And that led to his death. So his death even was surrounded by this question of the what does it mean to be Vietnam? What does it mean to be this country, this heritage or this origin? What origin should we make up? Or should we rewrite? Or should we research and or manipulate? So that's why I kind of like um, feel that it is the dilemma of himself, but also maybe the dilemma of the country, of the Southern Vietnam, to navigating of these powers and then die young. Yeah.
I think
We cannot take any questions, right?
No
We-
more.
Okay, okay. I think we're gonna wrap up here because there's another section about putting more notes on the stickers there, right? So I think we're gonna wrap up here. Thank you to for this great discussion. Yeah.